Adonai Elohim melech haolam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Varivna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu b'cha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzenu v'tze'etzem b'cha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodea shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah l'amo Yisrael.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher v'chabanu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Now, we're still doing the refuah for Shuki Schwartz, who had a stroke. Please God, she makes a full recovery. Shulamit Esther Bat Sapora Devorah, and for Craig Siegel's mom, Nachama Ela Bat Chana Riva. Okay, and I hope they both make a full refuah shalema. Now we're speaking in terms of the Mishnah Brura and Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch, and we're talking about which fruits get a shechian and which don't. Okay. So based on the rules mentioned, what's considered new? Here's some practical examples. So if we look at bananas, lemons, lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, all of these don't get a shechianu since they're not majorly significant and they're always grown, they're always available. So potatoes, carrots, onions, apples, and nuts don't get a shechianu since they are cold stored and the new ones don't have a very different taste from the old ones. When you look at an avocado, watermelon, peach, guava, cherry, lychee, mango, nectarine, apricot, grapes, and strawberry, they do get a shechianu as they're not available throughout the year and they are very seasonal. A pomelo, grapefruit, orange, and clementina, which is in South Africa, nachi, things that have completely different names, tastes, and appearances do get a separate shechianu, even though they're similar. Why they're similar? They're all citrus in this case, as an example. So it's the same with black grapes and green grapes. They each get a shechianu if they're eaten separately, but not if they're eaten together.
Okay.
Apples, you've got pink lady, golden delicious, sour green or red pear, yellow apple pear don't get a separate shechianu, even when they're not eaten together, as they're still the same type of fruit with just a slightly different name, and the change in taste is not major. Okay. So that's the halacha. So we're going to hit on the Gemara. We were at 16a2 yesterday.
Okay.
All right. Now, just one thing I wanted to mention in the show that, Michael and I discussed, which we kind of both feel the frustration, is that sometimes when you're learning, there's a frustration which is natural, where you feel like, either just get to the bottom line or you're holding back all the information and we're playing around for 20 minutes with one word, and it can drive me mad preparing it. I can tell you that. I love learning Torah and I love preparing, and I know it's what Hashem wants and I'm happy to do it. But the way that it's set forth is frustrating, because today you have everything at your fingertips with the information and there's no words hidden. There's no agendas hidden, and it's all clear. So this is frustrating. So there's only two suggestions. Number one, I suggest that you leave Gemara alone and you go and learn halacha, because the halacha is bottom line. Or you kind of suck it up and realize that it's what Hashem wants, even if we're not always in the mood for it. The reality is, I think what's happening is over the centuries, as I was mentioning to Michael, is that today we've got a Schottenstein and we're very blessed. All the cases are there. All the brises are there. We learned in Rav Simcha Steinhaus Shir that not everybody had access to the same brises. So it was people getting together from different parts of the world, Eretz Yisrael, Babylon, etc., over different centuries, and trying to piece together this jigsaw puzzle and then trying to apply it to law when people were changing. The world was changing.
Yeah.
Society was changing, economics. And sometimes maybe the only thing is I feel that maybe I don't appreciate the context of why certain things were missing. What I want to try and do is find a shiur for us quickly, not today, where it would explain this. Maybe I need to look at Rabbi Berelwan, maybe I speak to Rabbi Cohen, maybe somebody has addressed this issue of why this process is so frustrating. Because I think if we understand what we're doing, I mean, there's a whole book by Schottenstein now, it's about this thick, that says Introduction to the Talmud, a whole book on it. It's the size of Bava Kamma. So maybe this sort of thing pieces together, or we've got a 20-minute share that actually what's going on here. And maybe that'll take away some of the frustrations. Let's be honest about it. It's a very frustrating process. So I'm going to try and see what I can do, because maybe that'll help us develop a bit of an appreciation.
You're doing well. We have to do this. We have to do this.
No. But do you know what I'm saying, Michael? If we have a greater, like Rabbi Beruwan is a historian, if we have a greater context, then in that case, it might settle us down a bit, because we'll have a proper appreciation of actually the process. At the moment, I don't have an appreciation of the process. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm just being honest. Whether I have this in the shir or edited out, I just, Gav, we're not feeling this at the moment, because in Sanhedrin, we're doing a gadata. And the parts of Sanhedrin were a little bit easier than this, to be honest. I don't know if you agree. They really were. It wasn't just that it was, yeah.
But I agree with Schottenstein. I agree. They've thrown everything in, and it's for us now to dissect it, basically, They've thrown in everything that's of relevance. And some of it seems like duplication. And they also want to cover themselves, because the examples are subtly different in every single one. You'll see that. So I think they've done the right thing. And if you look at it, I tell you something, last year, all I heard, it was Hashem speaking to me. I believe that. You guys might not believe that. All I heard is that you got to toil in Torah. And I wasn't really doing that. I was listening to a lot of Shirim. I was going to Cecil Steinhauer, which is Gomorrah, but it's like listening a lot, because there's not that much toiling. Yeah, we're toiling. If you read this on a Saturday, you really got to toil, because some of it seems like repetition. You got to work out why it's different. Why is this price different to this? And why is this different to this? So it actually really pushes you. And I think that's what Hashem wants, and that's the purpose of the whole thing,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, I don't know, I just kind of maybe think that to have a bit of an appreciation as to why it's this way might just add a little bit of value. I don't think it can hurt. So I want to try and see if I can get hold of something that will help us, if that makes any sense to you guys. 16A2, an animal is not considered a mu'ah to gore, nor to squat on objects and destroy them. An animal is not considered a mu'ah to gore, nor to squat on objects and destroy them. The Gemara qualifies the Mishnah's ruling. Rav Elazar said they taught this ruling only in regard to large jugs, for it's unusual for an animal to squat on large jugs. Okay? We're on to now 16A3, but in the case of small jugs, it's normal for an animal to squat down on them. Thus, if it does so and crushes them, it's considered a mu'at. The Gemara cites support for Rav Elazar's ruling. Shall we say that the following brisa supports Rav Elazar? For a brisa taught, an animal is considered a mu'at to walk in its ordinary way and break utensils, and to crush a person, an animal, or utensils. Now, this brisa clearly states that an animal that crushes utensils is a mu'at, while the Mishnah states that an animal that squats and crushes is not a mu'at. Is it not reasonable to assume then that Rav Elazar's distinction is correct, and that the Mishnah speaks of large jugs on which animals do not usually squat, while the brisa speaks of small ones on which animals will squat? Okay, now I want to unmute all of you guys, which I'm doing. Now, I wanted to ask you guys the following, now that you're unmuted. Do any of you know what's going on here, or do you want me to explain it?
I thought let's just go through one more time.
All right, we're going to go through it, and we're going to unblow it blow by blow. Okay? So at the bottom of 16A2, the Mishnah states, this is in the Mishnah itself, an animal is not considered mu'ad to gore, nor to squat on objects that and destroy them. So what I want to do is I just want to share my screen a second, show you where it is. Okay. Have a look here. Yeah. A domestic animal is not considered a muad to go, nor to push, nor to bite, nor to squat, nor to kick. Now it's going to be asking a question on squatting and kicking, etc. You see the sentence is not considered muad to squat. So let's just firstly analyze this. Why is it not considered muad to squat, guys? That's my first question to you. Let's unpack this piece by piece.
Maybe because it's natural.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we've got to distinguish the difference between things that look similar to each other. It's an excellent point you guys have made. Is that there are two types of kicking. Let's just take kicking as an example.
Okay.
There's the natural kicking of the foot of the ox. Okay. In other words, when an animal walks normally, in the course of its walking, that's regal. So if it crushes things when it's walking, if it knocks things with its body, if you look at stroros, where the horse kicks up pebbles, etc., this is the natural way an animal moves. That's normal. You're right. The kicking here, we're talking about something slightly different. The very fact that we're talking about kicking here, with regards and the squatting to goring, pushing, etc., this is a case of keren. Exactly, Gavin. This is a case of keren. So when an animal kicks here, it kicks in temper. It kicks in order to injure or kill. And because an animal doesn't usually lose its temper, it's considered unusual damage, which is another feature of keren. Again, keren has two features. Its intent is to what? Its intent is to injure or kill, whereas a regal animal doesn't have an intention. It's the natural course of its moving. Okay? And it's common damage. Keren damage is unusual damage because an animal is usually considered tame, and when it wants to injure or kill, it's considered unusual damage. So here we want to distinguish between factors of keren and factors of regal. So when we say a domestic animal, if you look at my mouse, is not muad to squat, we are talking about keren damage because it is tame. It's tam for the first 2 times. So therefore, that's the reason it's not muad to squat or kick. Because if it's keren, it's considered tame. Okay? That's number 1. Fine. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and now it's an easier way to break it down for you guys. So we're saying the Mishnah states an animal is not a muad to gore nor to squat on objects and destroy them. Because squatting is a torda of the av of keren to go. Okay? The Mishnah now the Gemara wants to qualify the Mishnah's ruling. So what it's doing now is it's bringing a statement by Rav Elazar. So Rav Elazar said they taught this ruling only in regard to large jugs, for it's unusual for an animal to squat on large jugs.
What's a jug?
Okay.
A jug. Where does the animal squat in a jug?
Okay, so this is what we're going to determine. What the heck is going on here? We don't know. What's this thing of a jug? Exactly, Michael. You know,
Isn't that water jugs that they used to carry water around with?
Okay, so what we want to distinguish is the statement of what's considered the animals. The first thing that we've got to consider here is not the action. We have to look at the animal's intent to a certain degree. Does that make sense? So the reasons it's talking about a jug is we're talking specifically in the case of we can't be talking in the public domain. Why? Necessarily. Because if we're talking about regal, then we're talking about the damaged party's domain. Otherwise, the default position for regal and shane is what? Is that the animal is exempt. So if we talk about regal and shane and we talk about muad, the natural inference is that it's in the damaged party's premises. Now, if we're talking about an ox and we say it's not muad to squat in jugs, we mean it's in the public domain. Or it could be in the domain of the damaged party. Remember, the rabbis are not like Rabbi Tarfon. They say that it's tam in the damaged party's premises, as well as the public domain, because it's unusual damage for keren. So let's just get this clear. So Rav Elazar said they taught this ruling only in regard to large jugs, for it's unusual for an animal to squat in large jugs. So what it's saying is that the minute there's a cow, and a cow sits down and squats, you can see the word crouch, either the word crouch, because, you know, a lion wouldn't, for example, squat. Squat, you imagine this big elephant or heifer lump sitting down on it, and that's more squatting. It's like a visual thing, whereas crouching gets down on all fours, if it's more of a feline. But the bottom line is, if there's a big obstruction in the way, an animal is not going to naturally injure itself. And if it had to squat down on a clay pot, it doesn't want shards of ceramics impaling it. Does that make sense? Nobody sits on a stone. Just think of us as humans. If there's a whole lot of little pebbles or on a beach where it's fine sand, you can sit down on the beach. But if it's one large stone, you're not going to sit down and injure your coccyx bone or your muscles. You don't do it because it doesn't feel comfortable. And it's a big eyesore. You can see a obstruction where you're about to sit. Even animals can see an obstruction. It doesn't sit where there's something in the way. So what Rav Elazar says is that if a big animal like a cow squats on a large jug, that alone should tell you that's not regal damage. That is carrying damage, because it's not usual for an animal to sit on something that's impeding its way of walking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or to squat in it because of the size of the object. An animal generally will watch what it's going to squat on. It won't just squat. The only time it will squat is when an animal naturally wants to rest and squats on something that's small, because that small thing is insignificant. Does that make sense? So we've got to look at the practicality of this, of what an animal intends to squat on. Again, if it's too big, it's known as unusual damage. So there are two factors of carrying. The one is intent to damage. Now, an animal, when it sits on an object, its intention is not to damage. Its intention is to sit. But because it's unusual for an animal to want to injure itself, right? Because it's unusual, then an animal would be considered carrying damage. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So we don't only look at the animal's intent, but if an animal would not naturally sit on something that's an obstruction to it without noticing it, then that's considered carrying because of the unusual nature. If it's insignificant and the animal will sit down wherever because it's of no consequence, that's considered regal, the normal way that an animal moves. Okay, so that's clear. So let me get on to the next part. So that this is now on 16a3. And it says, but in the case of small jugs, it's normal for an animal to squat down on them. Thus, if it does so and crushes them, it's not considered a muad. Okay? Sorry, it is considered a muad. So in other words, we're saying in the case of small jugs, it's normal for an animal to squat down on them and then considers it muad. Why is it considered muad? Because in the case where it's normal, it's considered regal. And then for regal damage, there's not a case of time. Because it's common damage of an animal naturally moving or sitting down. That would be a case of regal, and therefore it's muad and it's full damages. Now, clearly in the case where an animal damages while it's walking, it's not in the public domain because you're exempt for shein and regal. So what we're talking about is maybe a corner of the market, like if you go to the shuk in Israel, where there's a common walkway and then the individual stores. So if you had an animal that damaged contents in an individual store, that would still be technically in a private domain, even though people come and participate there. So we're saying that the guy might have had one or two display jugs out there and your animal came past, and if it was a small jug sat on it, we would say in that case, you're not liable because it's the way the animal, you're fully liable because that's the way that the animal naturally moves. If you had a big display jug and the animal came and sat on it, and it was to the degree that it could almost injure itself on it because it's huge and it's an obstruction, you only have to pay half damages because of the unusual nature of the animal. That's all it's saying. Then it goes on and it cites a support for Rav Elazar's ruling. It says, shall we say the following brisa supports Rav Elazar? For a brisa is taught, an animal is considered a muad to walk in its ordinary way and break utensils. and to crush a person, an animal, or utensils. So again, the Brisa said an animal is considered muad. In other words, full payment, fully responsible from choice property, when it walks in its ordinary way and breaks utensils and crushes a person and an animal and utensils. Now, this Brisa clearly states that an animal that crushes utensils is a muad, while the Mishnah states that an animal that squats and crushes is not a muad. Is it not reasonable to assume then Rav Elazar's distinction is correct, and the Mishnah speaks of large jugs on which the animal do not usually squat, while the Brisa speaks of small ones in which the animal will squat? Okay. So the first thing that the Brisa is saying is, hang on, the Brisa has taught us something different to the Mishnah, in Rav Elazar's opinion. It's saying that you muad if you crush utensils, a person or an animal, because its only way is to, when it's walking, is to break things. Does that make sense? So we're saying this seems like a support for Rav Eliezer, because he's saying for small jugs, it's muad to break things because it's natural in the way the animal moves. It would seem that this Brisa is a proof for Rav Eliezer. Does that make sense? Guys, not if it makes sense.
No.
So it's saying, hang on a second, this doesn't actually make sense in total. Why doesn't it make sense? Because the Brisa itself doesn't distinguish between small and large jugs. So the first thing is, we want to say maybe this Brisa is a proof for Rav Elazar, because it says you muad for objects, utensils, and people in the way that the animal naturally walks. But Rav Elazar says you only muad for smaller jugs, because that's the way an animal won't notice it. It's insignificant, and if it squats down in it, it's completely usual damage, common damage. And it's saying, but hang on a second, the Brisa never made a distinction between small and large jugs. So in fact, not only is it not necessarily a proof for Rav Elazar, but it could be a refutation. Because what are you going to say with regards to large jugs, where he said it's half payment because it goes under carrying because it's unusual, when the Brisa turns around and says it's normal for an animal when it's walking to break utensils and to damage people and other animals. So I'm gonna read this to explain. It says the Gemara rejects the proof. Perhaps the Brisa is speaking of a case in which an animal crushes utensils from the side, rather than squatting on them. So squatting on a utensil, however, may possibly be considered unusual even in the case of small utensils. All right, so the first thing that the Brisa is saying, look, and when an animal naturally walks, we don't think of squatting as part of the way an animal naturally walks. We think of how an animal naturally walks as either crushing it by its body weight is on it and its feet are on it, or it's crushing it by moving its body to the sides or knocking it over. So the fact that it sits down to squat in it, it would seem, is perhaps not the way Rav Elazar mentions it. And the fact of it is that the Brisa speaks of a case when the utensils, etc., you muad, when you knock it over, you crush it from the side in the way that the animal naturally moves. Then the Gemara presents another version of Rav Elazar's ruling. It says there, those who say Rav Elazar said that it's only the case of large jugs that it's abnormal for an animal to squat down on them. But in the case of small jugs, it's normal for it to do so, for this is untrue. Rather, even in the case of small jugs, it's abnormal for an animal to squat down on them. Thus, the Mishnah's ruling applies to all jugs. Okay, so according to this version, the Gemara cites the Brisa as a challenge to Rav Eliezer. Okay, so let's just picture this. Let's just picture that it's going down in time, and I've got two different versions of what Gavin said. I've got my version. We were all at dinner together, and we were all sharing a Pesach Seder. Now, we were all at the dinner together, and Gavin told over something that happened in his week. Now, Michael's got a different version of the events to Gavin, and Gavin, and I've got a different version of the events to what Gavin said. Now, you can see this typically in a husband and wife. Where do you see this? Is that if you ask how they met, the husband, if he barely remembers the details, and it's for his good health if he does remember the details and how they met, by the way, he's got a certain version of events, and she's got a different version of events. You see this often in Hollywood movies, that the way they remember the event is completely different. Does that make sense? So we're saying that there was a group of people that had heard Rav Elazar's statement as saying one thing, and what's it saying? It's usual for an animal to squat down on small jugs, and on big jugs it's unusual. So small jugs would be regal because it's usual and the way it moves and squats, etc. And big jugs, unusual because it could end up injuring the animal and the animal can see it. So that was the first part of Rav Elazar's statement. And there's another version. So the other version said something different. It says, do not say that it is only in the case of large jugs that it's abnormal for an animal to squat down on them. But in the case of small jugs, it's normal for it to do so. So this is untrue. Rather, even in the case of small jugs, it's abnormal for an animal to squat down on them. That's the Mishnah's ruling applies to all types of jugs. So what it's saying is Rav Elazar didn't say that. That's what the second version is that people say he didn't say what he said originally, that he basically said that whether the jugs were large or smaller, it's still considered it's still considered abnormal, whether it's small or large jugs, okay? So according to this version, the Gemara cites the Brisa as a challenge to Rav Elazar. Why? Because if you want to say it's this version, they objected to this ruling from the Brisa, which states, and an animal is considered muad to crush a person, an animal, or utensils. So this Brisa clearly indicates that there's a case of crushing utensils for which the animal is muad. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mark, are you looking puzzled?
No, that's fine.
So what it's basically saying is that whether you want to say that the animal is allowed to crush certain types of jugs or not other jugs, or you're saying it's exonerated in the case of big or large jugs, the bottom line is that there seems to be a contradiction with the Mishnah in the Brisa. What is the contradiction? It says that for squatting, it doesn't mention jugs or anything. It says the animal is not muad because it's considered squatting a tordos of keren. And the Brisa said that if an animal crushes utensils, small people, when it says people, it obviously mentions small children, small animals, etc. This is the natural way an animal moves, whether it moves to the side or squashes on it. Let me just turn. Absolutely normal. So we're seeing the contradiction that it's not considered a case of keren, unusual damage, but normal for an animal to crush things as it walks, if it sits down. You see, here we're not seeing a squatting as a dafka activity where the animal sits down in temper. We're saying the animal walks, it knocks things on the side, it knocks things with its body, it crushes things with its feet, and an animal will sit down to rest. And that you muad for. You're fully responsible for payment because it's the natural way the animal moves. When the Mishnah says that it's not muad for squatting on things, it's talking about unusual damage where the animal squats down in temper. So now what we want to do is we basically want to have almost a reconciliation of the difference of the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa. So the Gemara answers, Rav Elazar said, perhaps the Brisa speaks of a case where the animal crushed the utensils from the side rather than by squatting on them. In other words, on the Brisa, when it said that animal is muad, it would say, listen, it makes sense if you want to say that the animal in its natural way of walking crushed a little animal, a child, or utensils because it was the way an animal naturally walked. But with regards to squatting, is that the normal part? So we're trying to propose that maybe it said it was the way it walked and crushed these objects on its side with the Brisa, because the Brisa, again, wasn't specific in its wording either. It just said that an animal, in the way that it naturally walks, let me just use the word. An animal is considered a muad to walk in its ordinary way and break utensils and crush a person and an animal in utensils. So there again, it doesn't mention necessarily squatting. It could be that at a certain point, it's usual that an animal would sit down. But it seemed to imply in the brisa in the way that an animal naturally moves. So we're saying that maybe there's not a contradiction, and that we're saying the brisa is when an animal crushes utensils on the side, it's muad as it's walking, whereas the Mishnah is talking about keren damage when the animal dafka sits down to squat because it's so unusual on objects, etc. So we're saying, so the Gemara now presents a third version. I know you have to go in 4 minutes, Michael. The Gemara presents the third version of the discussion. In this version, Rav Ela's ruling was offered as a solution to the contradiction between the Mishnah and Brisa. So now we're going to see the resolution. There are those that pose it as a contradiction. We learned in our Mishnah an animal is not considered a muad to gore nor to squat, but it was taught in a brisa an animal is considered a muad to crush a person, animal, utensils. So the Gemara answers, Rav Elazar said there's no difficulty. Here in the Mishnah, we're speaking about large jugs on which it's unusual for an animal to squat, but here in the brisa, we are speaking of small jugs in which it's normal for an animal to squat. So what Rav Elazar is saying is he's standing by his opinion. He's saying it's not a contradiction. If an animal is naturally walking and it squashes things on the side, or it's walking at a point where it rests, okay, it comes and sits down on it. In that particular case, it's muad because it's a natural way that an animal moves and rests. When it's a large jug, an animal can see it's a hindrance and an obstruction. And therefore, if it sits on it where the shards could damage the animal and it's an obstruction, it's considered unusual. And that would be keren, and that's half damages. So Rav Elazar comes to almost resolve the contradiction between the brisa and Mishnah and saying there is no contradiction. It's situationally applicable in terms of context. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Any question? Marco, I see you have a question or frustration.
I understood everything you said until you said it's situation.
Well, I'm saying situational. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
I understand what you're saying. I'm fine.
Okay. All it's saying is that there's no contradiction. It's saying, listen, if you're getting, you see, in those days they didn't have it all in one book. Gavin's right. So somebody heard of a brisa from their great uncle, and it seemed to say that an animal is muad if it crushes utensils. Then somebody else read a Mishnah and says you're not muad to if you squat. So he's saying what happens if you squat on utensils? And this whole argument came up and said, well, do you apply the brisa or the Mishnah? Now Gavin's right. It's all very well if you've got it all in front of you, then it seems obvious, but it's not. So we're saying the situation is depending upon its animal's natural movement, etc., etc. Would it be an unusual thing? In other words, do we examine, is it a common way that the animal would do it? Most animals, is it unusual? That would determine keren or regel, whether it's half damages or full damages. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Guys, we're done. We ended early, and I want to thank you for your time. We've got 10 minutes left.
Yeah,
all right. Have a lovely day, guys. Okay.
You too. Thanks, Damon. Thanks,
Cheers.
guys.